What you are about to see is one session of a series of remote viewing sessions that were conducted in September and October 2024, where the focuses are on the domestic military activity that will occur in the continental United States in the months of December 2024, January 2025, and February 2025. Now, the remote viewer for this session is Aziz Brown. For each focus, the target is the most important event that would describe the level of domestic engagement of the U.S. military in that particular month. The world is in such a precarious state currently, with the war in the Middle East involving Israel and its neighbors, and the war in Europe involving Ukraine and Russia, both threatening to spill into wider conflicts, plus the political polarization in the United States. It seemed natural to ask if anything might happen that could affect the deployment of military resources within the United States. Many wars only affect the United States indirectly, as they take place in distant lands. But it is unclear if that will always be the case. So we decided to take a look with a Farsight Deep News project. We have results from 4 remote viewers for this project, and we hope to publish all of them as single sessions before the start of December 2024. And as with all of our Deep News sessions, they will appear on both FARSIGHTPrime.com and YouTube. There are no advertisements on FARSIGHTPrime.com, and captions are offered there in multiple languages. To be honest, I do not understand the results for this project. None of this was expected. All of the sessions contain data that seem disturbing, to say the least. But we are faithful to our mission here at Farsight, and we publish our raw data for all to see, no matter what. We learn with each project along with everyone else. All right, Aziz. Well, here we are with the Deep News. And just for the sake of the audience, if you can tell them that you know nothing about the target or nothing about the project at all. Is that right?
I know nothing about the target, nothing about the project at all.
So we're going to let you go through your session and tell you what it was and what you got, and then I will tell you what the actual target is after that, and we'll get your reactions. All right?
Sounds great.
Okay, I'm looking at your page 4 now, and we're skipping some of the preliminaries, and what we have here is a sketch and some description. Why don't you start?
Great. So my initial perceptions were really just a gritty, tan, hard, rough, semi-regular base surface. I saw lots of structures, low-level structures. I deducted maybe a shabby look to some of them. I saw a hill or a sloped mountain in the background, gritty air, basically multiple subjects in what feels like an urban area, low elevation structures once again. I saw this hill sort of in the background as well. Generally, this was a man-made environment. I saw loud sounds, sort of something that I deducted a siren. It just seemed like electrical or artificial sound. There was a cool temperature in the air, and I got a dominant session element, which seemed to be a subject in dark, long attire with headgear, and I saw sort of a white color around sort of the right below the head, but down towards the upper torso area. So that was pretty much what I was initially perceiving. I did a flash sketch later on, which was sort of a more wide perspective of that urban environment. Saw some cloud dynamics in the air, as well as some light that came from up there as well. And continuing on with my flash sketches, I just saw a dark attired male subject. More flash sketches, I started to see other sort of visuals of like this multiple structures, urbanish area, a mountain to another area. And this time I saw sort of a poof of energetics with this wide open area, so like a vastness. Basically, I sort of put this in a deduction, but I thought of my first sort of warm-up ideograms when I saw this vastness. I was wondering if I was perceiving water or something like that, but I didn't know for sure. I saw a wide open vastness, and within it a poof of energetics. Then continuing on, I started to perceive this male subject in formal attire, and this subject seemed like he was in an indoor environment, kind of a techie indoor environment, as that seemed to be sort of gizmos and gadgets looking large objects that were sort of plaqued onto the wall. And I saw sort of a very metallic texture in the environment, sort of these mechanical stuff sort of associated with the walls in these box shapes. He wasn't alone. There were multiple subjects in the environment as well, and that's what brought me to Focus 1. So in Focus 1, I went and saw from the center of the target this multiple visuals. The first visual I saw was multiple structures on this sort of tannish land, and from that area with multiple structures, this non-surface object seemed to rocket up out of that environment and sort of just shoot across the sky. And it had mostly horizontal movement above the base surface, but it wasn't like it's like crazy far away from the base surface. It seemed like it was just in the air. And I was perceiving shaking and this sort of vibratory energy around. Once again, I was picking up a little bit of cooler temperatures in the higher parts of the environment, but that's when the second visual came around, where I was perceiving this large hot cloud of mucky heat-filled particulates just rising out of an environment that also had multiple structures. It seemed like a wider environment with more structures in this area, but it was just like this mushroom cloud plume of particulates and grit just sort of like rising out of this environment. And once again, I'm perceiving rumbling at the base surface, roaring sounds, screaming sounds, like not a voice screaming, but sort of like the scream of a very fast jet engine sound. That was sort of a deduction. It's a bit of a high-level term to say a jet engine, but still that sort of screeching of that artificial nature, sort of screening across the landscape. And also there was that semi-low pitched ripping sort of manner of this artificial non-surface object body sort of screeching across the sky, and this plume of mushroom cloud particulates that rose out of this multiple structured urban-ish environment. So then I continued on. And once I got to page 10, I started seeing a completely different environment. This environment at first felt like it was underground, but visually I just see that it's indoors and artificially lit. The walls seem like a gray, hard texture, and I don't see any windows. It seems kind of windowless, so this is sort of going along the lines of this underground perspective that I was perceiving. And it seemed like there was a dominant subject. Everyone seemed like they were in formal attire. Let me just start off by saying that. And the dominant subject seemed like the dominant subject had this very light hues grayish hair, pale skin, a very stern face, serious demeanor. And this subject was speaking sternly to another subject who was not at this, what looked like a table with multiple subjects seated down at it. He was speaking towards another standing subject, which was a uniform attired subject with semi-light hues, skin, a bit more brownish hair, but mostly had a uniform attire, while everyone else seemed to be in formal attire. Now, the other seated subjects, there were males and females seated, and some of the, like for the female subject, I'm perceiving light brownish hued, sort of dark, I mean, I can kind of say a little bit of a darker blonde, but it doesn't really seem like it's more on the blonde spectrum. It was a bit more on the browner spectrum, but it was a female-looking subject. And then another subject adjacent to her seemed like an older male subject with sort of thin gray hues hair. And then there were other male subjects that were around. Most of the subjects seemed like they were male, but once again, that formal attire was pretty much ubiquitous between all of the seated subjects as well as the dominant subject right there. So, once again, dark bluish black formal attire with the male subject who's standing up. And then I went into a collective deep mind probe of the environment. It seemed like the standing subject is in a position of authority, sort of among the whole group of people there. He was like the top dog, And he's giving directions and orders to the uniformed subject who seemed to enter the room kind of like a butler or a waiter attending a dinner table, but there's no food and no such vibe of a dinner table. It just seems like this was more of a very serious experience. But everything seems very serious and stern, and there's this undercurrent of fear between all of the seated subjects present. It does seem like once the uniformed subject leaves, the standing subject sits back down and sort of starts directing the conversation amongst the seated subjects. The standing subject isn't angry at any point. It seems like he's just communicating and commanding a forceful demeanor to the uniformed subjects, and brings up this calmer, quote-unquote, inside voice when he's speaking to the seated subjects. Zooming out of this entire environment, I get this perception of like a more rectangular structure. It seems like there's foliage scattered around the outside of the rectangular structure, and I'm seeing roads that go around it and stuff like that, as well as other structures that are nearby. But this dominant rectangular structure seems to be extending quite deep underground. It seems like the majority of that structure is underground, and sort of a lower elevation of it is sort of just popped up above ground. Now, at the depths of that lower area, that's where those seated subjects were, and I made a couple of deductions just because of the nature of what this place looked like. I called it like a continuity of government facility, or like a bunker or something like that. Basically just a structure that is bigger underground than it is above ground. That was basically my initial assumptions there. But then I moved on to Focus 2. So moving to Focus 2 and describing the environment there, I was seeing a very much above ground environment. I saw big windows, an urban area sprawling outside of the windows. I was seeing a big table. I saw this long, dark, attired subject that was, it just had longer attire. I mean, it was just dark attired hues, and the subject seemed like that subject on one side of this big table looking space was in a position of authority. And once again, I'm kind of getting the sense of a more whitish hue around here, and headgear. Everything else seemed rather dark on the subject. So yeah, just dark hues attire, older, lightish hues skin. It seemed like white hues on this hair that I was perceiving. I was wondering if it was hair, but it was like facial hair or something like that. But regardless, I was just seeing that split between the darker attire and the lighter hues on the face. So then I started to perceive these other two subjects that were in the room with this long hues, a long attired subject. And they seemed to be two uniform subjects. One of the uniform subjects seemed like it was a subject who had more tannish hues to him, and it seemed like it has this subject had darker hair. And I sort of deducted like a camo military pattern on the subject. I deducted the military uniform thing. Once again, that's a high-level term, but it just seemed to come to mind with the general uniform nature of their attire. Then the other subject, I did not get the sensation of that camo sort of thing, but once again, I am picking up a uniformed attire, and I got a mixture of dark and gray hues hair to the subject, and that subject seemed older than the other subject in uniform attire. That other subject, the earlier one with the darker hair, that seemed like a younger looking subject. So then moving on to a collective deep mind probe, on page 13, I saw this dark, long, attired subject that seemed to be listening to the older of the uniformed subjects. Now they're all standing around this big table in this indoor environment, and there seems to be less fear here in the air than there was in Focus 1, but it also seemed very tense. The topic of discussion is very tense. Everyone seems to have a level of anxiety, but they feel, I guess, physical distance-wise, to be a bit further away from quote-unquote danger, despite knowing that they're not immune to danger. It feels like they are in a conflict that is serious, but the quote-unquote hot zone is just not right next to them at the moment. Then continuing on with the collective deep mind probe, I felt that there is this sense of attention to the skies, and I see this object or a projectile that descends down into their urban area around them, and it causes this energetics to sort of erupt in the environment. Now, I get this visual that comes in of this non-surface object descending out of the sky, and just this eruption of energetics that results from the impact into the base surface. And this base surface is full of structures. Now, I don't know if this is visually actually happening, or if this is just something that's happening during the collective deep mind probe in their minds, because this is a focus of theirs. But I saw this visual, I have to report it. Basically, the subjects inside of the structure with the big windows, they're right near this explosive energetics, and a huge gust of energetics and particles in the air flood the room, and destructive energetics flood the room, and it knocks everybody over. It completely trashes the indoor of this environment. People are being, of these three subjects, they're all sort of just being ragdolled out of this environment. And that really ends focus 2 and brings us to focus 3 of the session on page 16. So when I move to focus 3, I get this big visual of a lighter skin, older male subject in formal dress, blue hues attire, and that subject seems to be standing in a very techie environment, very artificial room, and there are some seated subjects and some standing subjects around him. And of these seated subjects and standing subjects, they seem to be uniform subjects as well. These are very uniformed individuals, and they seem like they're basically plugging away at this technological stuff that's in front of them as they're seated down. And then I start doing a collective deep mind probe to find out what's going on in this environment, and it seems that the standing formal attired subject asked a question to the seated subject, who responded verbally with a detailed answer. The vibe here feels very professional and stern and detail-oriented, and sort of surrounding a pre-set out playbook of actions. Everybody is going through strict procedures and protocols, little to no spontaneous improvisation, and really this room just really does seem very artificial and packed with technology. I feel like these subjects are on the attack, but mentally they aren't in a aggressive charge mentality. It's more like they're playing chess at a very far distance by following a strict pre-planned directional playbook where all actions are pre-programmed so that everyone just does their part of a recipe, a big recipe. And I started getting sort of a deduction to say that this is like a well-oiled machine, but I feel like this is, I can see a feel that everyone's just doing their part of a recipe. And I get a feeling that the data about non-surface objects crashing into urban spaces are unleashing these huge, massive energetic clouds, but I also feel like there is a feeling of massive physical distance between the subjects in this technology-filled environment and any of the technology that is puppeting this involvement in this form of attack. So, just to recap, there's this techie-filled room with subjects. All the subjects in this room feel very focused, very dialed in, and I get this puppetry sense, and there's massive distance between another location, also with some technology, and they're puppeting this other location, and that other location has this visual of the rocketing off of non-surface objects, and those non-surface objects running into, flying down into other locations that are full of structures, urban areas basically, and then massive energetics pluming out of those areas. And there is a big distance between those two environments, but not as big of a distance as it is between the environment where these uniform subjects are in this techie-filled environment and the other technology-filled places that they're puppeting. Anyway, I continue with the collective deep mind probe, and I start to perceive these visuals of mountainous terrain, sort of kind of looks like a compound, but I'm getting the sense of this non-surface object rising out of an artificial base surface through these opening doors, and this mostly barren landscape with a few low elevation distant structures. I'm deducting a compound or something like that, but that's just what I'm seeing. And then I am continuing the collective deep mind probe, and I'm starting to perceive stuff like taller, distant structures in a very dense and extensive urban environment. And I'm also perceiving this wide structure that's sort of in the foreground, and it's sort of a focus of attention. And then I redrew that in the foreground of my sketch just to give a better image of what it looked like. And it seemed like this is another one of those structures that's much bigger underground than it is above ground. I deducted the Pentagon but the structure doesn't really look like the Pentagon. It seems like this low, wide, and a bit more rectangular looking structure, and it feels very military-esque and very dense with many rooms all over the place, and it's full of subjects. But the structure appears at the top of the base surface quite as this low-level, wide structure, but in the bottom of the base, like as it extends underground, there is this room, and within that room, that is that technology-filled room with this sort of array of other subjects that are engaging in this puppetry activity, sort of puppeting technological compounds that are further away, that are involved directly with this sending off of non-surface objects that are causing these plumes of energetics. But that does conclude all of the data that I have for this session.
Well, all right. You ready to hear what the target is then?
Very much so, yeah.
This is not a target where I can sort of make a joke. I'll just have to tell you what it is. Has 3 different points in time: December 2024, January 2025, and February 2025. And the target is the level and type of domestic U.S., United States, military engagement within the continental United States. Yeah, that means the U.S. military fighting within the continental United States in December, January, and February. Focus 1 is December, Focus 2 is January, and Focus 3 is February. This is post-election, of course. And I was quite surprised by your session, but not too surprised. Anyway, so I was just curious. When I wrote this target up, I said, is the U.S. military going to be fighting anybody within the continental United States? That excludes only Alaska and Hawaii.
Well, that's a pretty shocking reveal. I wonder how much of this is going to be presented as such in the mainstream media. I mean, it's quite common to see that there are events that are surprising, that like explosive events or maybe chemical explosions and stuff like that, where people have reported that it was not like an accidental fire or an accidental experience that caused these sort of things, and that there was something deeper that happened in those events. So I wonder if this is going to be portrayed in the way that our target has portrayed it, with the idea of directed projectiles causing violent energetics into urban areas or other environments across great distances being an actual thing, or if this is going to be presented as isolated, wild instances of quote-unquote accident or terror that they might even try to just pin on a foreigner, like a foreign agent or something like that. I just don't know. I don't trust the mainstream media to actually say what this target is, as what you've said. So if any of those sort of explosive energetics do happen in any sort of urban environment, which explosive energetics happening, I mean, that's just something that happens. Fires start, explosive things sort of happen. But if they're happening like this, I wonder if we're going to get mainstream reportings that present it like this.
That's a good question. There is so much censorship. But if you segue out into our other projects at Farsight, where we deal with our extraterrestrial friends, we've been told point blank that the crises that we're going to be facing both domestically and internationally are designed to completely crash the information control system. So that while there is a tremendous amount of censorship, it'd be hard to censor this. And I think that's what our side of the ETs want. They want something that can't be censored.
You never know.
I mean, I'm looking at your results. I mean, we have to wait. All remote viewing has to be, checked with reality. So we have to wait until December, January, and February.
Yeah.
But let's also wait to see. You're the first person to complete this. So let's wait to see what the other viewers get. I was not expecting something like this much. So it's going to be very interesting. I thought maybe there might be some movement of military personnel lined up, sort of National Guard type stuff in the cities and things. But this is this is quite a step above that.
Well, also I would just say that if this was actually a thing, just to sort of be a devil's advocate for censorship, we've had just historically so many UFO experiences where people have said, "Oh, this is swamp gas." I mean, swamp gas is a ridiculous statement, but like people have just said that, and whether or not the public actually believes that, this swamp gas, this is that's one thing completely different. But I would never test the abilities of the mainstream to try to spin something that's obviously something else into something that is just an excuse they pulled out of a hat. I mean, I can easily see if this was actually something that did happen, if there, God forbid, I hope I'm wrong. But if this was actually something that did happen, if there was an energetics event that happened in an urban area, and that energetics event came from a projectile that was not reported in the media, but we just saw the energetics event, and then say somebody wanted to blame the entire thing. I mean, from the perspective of the target, you're saying this is something that was done domestically within the United States.
Yes.
From the perspective of somebody who wanted to cover something up and sort of prop up a typical narrative that is existing, I would wager a guess that somebody might write a news story that said this was Iran or something like that. And that's my speculation.
Yeah, we don't know how hard. I'm sure that the powers that be are going to try to spin things and censor things as much as possible.
Yeah.
But remember what we've been told from our ET friends. This whole period of time is designed to collapse the information control system, to force disclosure. This seems big enough to break down the censorship.
Well, I just so I can continue being the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
I saw not too long ago, a couple years ago, Nashville had this bombing explosion that happened, and I saw now I don't know the truth about what happened in Nashville, but I do know that there were quite a few people who said that I saw some videos of people using like maybe infrared cameras or something or another, and they were able to say that, look, this is a directed energy weapon that struck Nashville. And same thing with Hawaii. People were saying that the fires in Hawaii were started by directed energy weapons. Before that, there was the same thing with Paradise, California. So the idea of energetics exploding into an urban environment, that is a surprising thing. However, the reaction that I would expect from the powers that be to help quell and manipulate and maintain the status quo in the public would be to say stuff that's not admitting that this is a projectile or directed energy weapon, or at the very least they would do everything they could to prevent people from thinking this was an internal attack akin to some sort of civil war.
You can be guaranteed that the powers that be are going to do everything they possibly can to squash this.
Yeah.
And the real question is, will they be able to squash this?
Yeah, so I guess the thing to look for, not necessarily is a news story that says, hey, there was a domestic attack from one branch of the military to another.
Yeah. You're saying that they might try to blame it on terrorism, like Iran or something.
Terrorism, or just some radical political affiliation, or just to say it was a lone person who just let off a bomb, even though it was a projectile from someplace else.
Yeah, actually, we don't have any. I have here domestic military engagement, but it doesn't say who they're fighting. So it technically could be an engagement domestically from abroad.
That could also be the case, but it's you never know. It's like, the point is, I think the lowest level interpretation of this is within the time span that you have mentioned, there might be an energetics explosion of some sort within the continental United States.
I mean, heck, it could be North Korea shooting stuff at us. So
maybe, yeah. So, but anyway, I think how
you're right. It doesn't say what the sides are.
It doesn't say what the sides are, and it doesn't say how it'll be presented to the public in terms of the mainstream. We could really end up finding out that this was just an energetics event could happen in a sort of small environment inside of an urban area that would totally match the session, and we could end up just seeing a news story that said that this was a lone disgruntled political radical of one of the parties.
Or something coming from abroad.
Or something coming from abroad.
A terrorist attack.
Yeah. So, but we would know from watching this session that it was the culprit was a bigger, more institutionalized thing. Yeah. So that's useful information though. But anyway, that's me playing devil's advocate to quell worry, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we'll when it happens, if it happens, we'll be able to see. We'll be able to get some stories about who's actually doing it.
Yeah. I mean, we're definitely...
We'll find out.
We'll find out, and we're definitely in an exciting time for the history of the United States, for sure.
Yeah. All right, Aziz, on to the next one.
On to the next one. Great target.